It's February 2016. Julie and I are sitting in a overly posh lawyer's boardroom in London, England. We're there with representatives of the Anglican Church and their insurance company, and we're suing them. Why are two people who've dedicated their professional lives to finding alternatives to litigation suing? To understand that, we have to go back 40 years to a small town on the south coast of England.
I grew up in a town called Chichester in the south of England in the Sussex Downs. Chichester was a small place, not a lot of fun for a teenager. And one of the things that I got involved in my early teens to distract from the boredom of some of those years was the Billy Graham movement, which at that time was being a really important social phenomenon, this very evangelical brand of Christianity. And we felt it in the UK too. So I joined a group, which was mostly myself and my friends and young people, and we praised the Lord and spoke in tongues. And then after about a year or so, I decided that if I was really going to be serious about this religion thing, I needed to join a church. And so I joined a local Anglican church with an evangelical bent where the minister was a man named Marion Griffiths. And for the next year, I went to prayer meetings and youth group meetings and was very involved in the church, but gradually started to become a little disillusioned and wondering whether this religious thing really was for me. And so I decided that I would go and talk to the most obvious person that I should talk to when I had doubts about my faith as a young Christian. And by this time, I'm 16 years old. I went to meet with Marion Griffiths in the vicarage, the building, the home that he lived in with his family, and I met with him privately in his study. I told him that I was really experiencing a lot of doubts about my faith and I wanted his advice and his guidance. Marion Griffiths came around from the back of his desk and stood in front of me and told me to get off my chair and kneel in front of him. I did so. He then dropped his trousers and took out his erect penis, which he forced into my mouth. He told me that this was what God wanted me to do, and it would help me to resolve all of my crises and doubts around my faith. This was the beginning of almost a year of continuous stalking and repeated sexual assaults from this minister.
So fast forward 20 years. After Julie has spent a considerable amount of time coming to terms with what had happened to her and dealing with the trauma that brought into her life. Julie decides she needs to do something about this minister so that other people aren't similarly victimized. She does a search through the worldwide directory of Anglican ministers, and she finds Marion Griffith as a vicar in the Diocese of Perth, Australia. Julie contacts the diocese, and much to her surprise, they really listen. They've initiated a new process for dealing with these problems, and after listening to her story, they start a formal investigation of Griffith. He resigns. They write her a letter that he is no longer employed and never will be again by the Anglican Church. And Julie thinks that the situation is now resolved.
But I was wrong. It really wasn't over, as I thought it was in 1999. It was really just beginning. About another 10 years later, I was back in Chichester, my hometown, taking care of my mother, who was very ill, and I heard an item randomly on the local television news. It referred to Chichester as a notorious center of clerical sexual abuse, and in fact, there had just been a national level investigation and inquiry into the Chichester Diocese and the many cases of sexual misconduct that had been reported there amongst the clergy. I was flabbergasted because for the first time I realized this wasn't just me. It was many others as well. And I got in touch with the lawyer who was being interviewed in this news item, who was representing some of the victims of clerical abuse in Chichester. His name is David Greenwood. I got in touch with David and I said, look, my situation's resolved. The minister who abused me has been removed, and I don't feel like I need to take any other steps, but I would like to be able to speak out and encourage other people to come forward. David's response was, if you really want to make a difference, Julie, you need to bring a lawsuit against the church who employed him at the time that he did this to you, and that will help others see that the church needs to be held accountable. This seemed like a ridiculous idea. I mean, I just spent half a lifetime talking and researching and writing books about how litigation was a really bad idea. Why would I want to be involved in litigation? But this was a very particular reason to do litigation. And I also realized that I could be in this situation a very effective plaintiff. I thought long and hard. I talked to Bernie. I talked to my daughters. And then I said to David, okay, yes, let's go ahead and sue the church.
So while we struggled with whether we should go ahead in this manner, we also believed that part of effective conflict work is effective advocacy in a constructive spirit of trying to bring about real change. We began the suit with perhaps the naive idea that of course they would want to negotiate with us and they would want to settle. After all, he had already left the church had already apologized to him, and for him, pardon me, and we had also received an apology from the Archbishop of Canterbury. So we felt that they would settle down into a serious negotiation, which we wanted to be not so much about compensation, but about system change within the way the church handled these things. But instead, they reacted to us in a highly adversarial way.
So I started to live the reality of what I've been researching and writing about for so many years. I found myself in an extraordinarily adversarial lawsuit in which all the usual tactics that you might expect to try to crush a plaintiff were being used. I was told in the statement of defense, which arrived a little while later from the church, that apparently they would argue that I had consented to being sexually assaulted by the minister. This was extremely traumatizing and upsetting, but at the same time I was kicking myself because I knew this was what adversarial lawsuits do, even though this was obviously a completely ridiculous argument. It made me feel even more strongly that it was important not just to succeed in this lawsuit, but to change the system. The other thing that was really a tipping point for me as the back and forth continued for the next year or so was a letter that was received by my lawyer, David Greenwood, which he passed on to me from a lawyer who was part of the office of the Archbishop of Canterbury. That letter said, oh, of course, we're really, really sorry. But, we can't do anything because we have to do what the lawyers at the insurance company tell us to do. And our hands are tied. We have to take an adversarial approach. Now, I might be the worst person in the universe to try that line on because I know that clients instruct lawyers and not the other way around. And this absolutely infuriated me because it was once again passing responsibility. I have to say at that point, kind of defeated and upset, distraught even, for about a day. And then I pulled myself together and thought, okay, I need to expose this hypocrisy. I Googled and discovered that the Church Times is the world newspaper of the Anglican Church. I wrote to the editor and offered him an article, an op-ed that I would write, exposing the hypocrisy of the church, which at one time apologizes to sexual assault victims, and on the other hand, uses the most adversarial and positional strategies to try to defeat their claims. He went for it over the next 6 weeks. He very bravely faced down injunction threats over my article, and it was ultimately published in December of 2015. And lo and behold, in January of 2016, the church suddenly wanted to talk to us.
So now we go back to the boardroom in February 2016, where the negotiations were held. Both of us were present. Our daughter was present. And the best way, I think, to get at something about what that negotiation was like was to look at a few key moments. The first was about consent.
So I had worked on an opening statement for the negotiation. I'd actually done this with my students in dispute resolution at the law school. And one of the things that I had written was an invitation as part of that opening statement to the people around the boardroom table to participate in a role play with me around sexual consent. You can imagine that when I described what I was about to do, there were some misgivings and some looking away around the table, where there were around 8 or 9 people, either lawyers or adjusters from the insurance company. I don't think they'd ever been asked to role play a consent situation before. But I wanted to really get through to them how absolutely ludicrous it was to be making these types of arguments. So I said, let's imagine the situation in the minister's office that very first time that I was assaulted by him, and me kneeling in front of him and him forcing fellatio on me and telling me this was what God wanted. Can we try and role play, I said to the assembled group, what the consent conversation would have been in this situation? Needless to say, they all cleared their throats nervously and looked down at their yellow legal pads. There was dead silence.
The next moment that seemed critical was about apology. The church had come with what to me seemed like a very canned statement of apology that was at a critical moment delivered by the deaconess from Chichester in what felt like a very mechanistic way. We basically ignored it. We said apologies meant nothing now, action meant a lot. In fact, the more you apologize without actions, the worse it makes it. And this, again, took the second major strategy that they had brought to this and many other cases, I think, away from them, which was, we'll argue consent and then we'll offer this pro forma apology. The third moment was about what did we really want from them.
So I had decided by this point that so much of the motivation for me was about changing the process that people in my situation had to go through in order to bring a claim forward. It was not about the money. And so I explained that what I wanted as my settlement was a commitment to sit down with me as someone who'd worked on dispute systems design with many organizations in the past, and to design a new claims process that would be respectful of claimants, that would, for example, take some things immediately off the table. Consent arguments, bogus consent arguments, referring to minors, as I was at the time. Bogus arguments about the statute of limitations, that it was too long ago that nobody could remember. That the company should promise, the insurance company should promise to give all claimants immediate access to counseling paid for by the church, and that they would walk themselves towards settlement in ways that were going to be much more committed and efficacious than the process that I'd gone through, which had just dragged on and on and on. Now, to begin with, this message I was trying to give that I wanted system change, not money, really didn't seem to take root. The reaction was, well, that's very interesting. That's very interesting, Professor Macfarlane. We'll talk about that at the end. And I had to say several times, no, we're going to talk about it now, because this is what I actually want for my settlement. And I'm quite certain that we can resolve any monetary compensation in about 15 minutes. I was actually correct about that. That did take about 15 minutes. But the negotiation over a new system, a new claim system, took several months. I returned to London again because I wanted to be part of these discussions. And until I was satisfied with what we had, which again comprised the elements that I've already spoken of and a number of others besides, which you can read about if you're interested, until I was satisfied with that, I was not signing a settlement. However, that was what I eventually did, and the new process is now in place on the insurance company's website, and I also wrote some explanatory notes for claimants to help them go through the process.
So did the fact that we are conflict professionals, mediators, people who teach mediators and negotiators, make a difference in how we handle this? I think clearly it did, but it's a little hard to distill that out from all the rest of our life experiences in our particular circumstance. Perhaps the most important way it made a difference is that we were very bound and determined to articulate in as powerful a way as we could our interests and our concerns in a non-positional way, but a very clear way, and at the same time doing it in a way that allowed them to come up with a constructive response. And I think we succeeded in that. And there were probably a lot of other ways about how we framed issues, how we responded to things that we found irritating. But I think a lifelong working in this probably does make us more prepared to deal with these kinds of negotiations as well.
So finally, why is this not just my story? Why is this our story, which it is? Well, to understand that, I'd have to take you back to when Bernie and I first met one another about 20 years ago. And in one of the very first conversations that we had, I told him something about my past history, including these particular events. I can't explain exactly why, but I just knew that this was someone to whom I could tell the story, and very few people knew at that time. And I knew as a result that that was someone who could be my partner.
And I knew that I had somebody at my side who is a strong, fearless advocate for the kind of change that I want to be part of. Now, it'd be nice to say this is a story that's entirely in the past, but it's not. These things seem not to end. Several years ago, sort of right after we went through this process, I believe, another woman came forward to the Chichester police and told a very similar story about the same person, Marion Griffith. And as a result of having two independent stories by people who did not know each other, they decided they needed to go forward with a criminal case. There was a 2-year process of extradition, and we are now in the middle of a criminal procedures against Marion Griffith. We can't really say more about it right now than that, but it's ongoing.